Yeah, I'm talking to Julia Grillmeyer here from Vienna, and she has a podcast there.
Thank you so much for taking the time. I really appreciate it. So, actually, like, my trip is the research I'm doing. I'm very interested in this intersection between futurism and science fiction. So I met a lot of people who understand this as a kind of science fiction as a tool to sketch scenarios, and they do that for communities, they do that in a corporate context, but also in universities, in academic research. Like, I met very different people, but a lot of them are inspired by science fiction, and I asked them if they consider that a trend, and they actually do, because it seems to show up more and more. What do you think about it?
And the question is the relationship between science fiction and futurism. And some futurists are quite well paid just for existing, and science fiction writers only get paid when they sell something. So there's a different kind of pressure on you to produce things. My friend Bruce Sterling, I've written a number of science fiction stories with him, and he often will consult as a futurist for companies like Global Business Network. And he always has a funny way of putting things. And he says, the companies that come and call in the futurists, they're the ones who know their business is dying and they're grasping at straws. And the thing is, science fiction, we're not really about predicting ways for people to make money. That's not really something that we care about. A lot of us are somewhat left-wing, and we hate business people anyway. But one of the things with science fiction, often the process is, in a way, it's similar to futurism. I look at the present and my surroundings and what's happening around me, and then I'll think, well, what if I dialed that up just another notch, just a little bit further? And that's sort of what futurists do too. Again, I'm not really interested in predicting future business conditions. I want to find a great story that's trippy and that's exciting and that will maybe enlighten me a little bit or frighten me and amuse me. And I do like it to be realistic, though. And so then there is a sort of intersection with futurism that I always like my science fiction stories to make sense. That's sort of a difference between science fiction and fantasy. The scenarios they depict aren't really so different. I mean, there's people flying or people shrinking or people traveling in time or reading other people's minds. But in fantasy, you're not obligated to provide any sort of explanation. You'll just wave a wand or something like that. And in science fiction, we feel like we have to make up some sort of explanation. Though usually these explanations are only paper thin. They're not very logical necessarily, but it is a process that we do. And maybe I, more than some science fiction writers, I'm into that, the sort of making the science make sense, because I was trained as a mathematical logician, and I have a PhD, and I like to think logically. So, and the process of doing that logical theory, it's useful for the fiction because it'll suggest things that I might not have thought of, and it'll suggest constraints that I hadn't thought of. And it's always good to have some constraints in your story, because then that's a challenge for the characters. So there is, as I say, there's this overlap from science fiction and futurism, but in many ways they're different, because the goals of science fiction are more to create art, and the goals of futurism are more to tell people how to make money.
And as I said, some people told me they really consider this as a trend right now, like the recent years. But I know you have been thinking about this for quite some time. So what do you think? Is there something new to this now, or is it just more, or is it just old wine in new vessels?
I think because science fiction has been around a lot, people are it's more the part of cultural fabric. It used to be more of a niche field for unsavory people. But now there's been so many movies and TV shows with science fiction themes, and there's also this element of future shock that things seem to us to be changing sort of rapidly in the world around us, the technology. And if we say, well, if we look at this science fictionally, it'll give us a way to sort of step back a little and kind of look at the world as if it's a story and be able to somehow get an angle on it. There's also science fiction is really permeating mainstream literature. There's now really a very large proportion of the books being published now. They actually are science fiction books, but because they're being put out as mainstream literary novels, the high mandarins don't want to say that their work is science fiction because that's scuzzy. It's for dirty, crazy people. And but so they'll always call this work is visionary, this is futuristic, this is a great feat of the imagination, a huge leap of thought. And often it'll just be using a trope that is really quite familiar to science fiction readers. It'll be a little bit of time travel, or some robots who look like people, or telepathy, and the critics will just be slack-jawed and wonder that somebody ever thought of such a thing. And if you're a professional science fiction writer, there's a bit of bitterness on our part, a bit of resentment that we invented this stuff and we don't get as much recognition as we would like. This said, I will say it's part of the nature of an author's personality to be bitter and resentful.
Well, there are a lot of science fiction writers involved in those projects, though. You just mentioned Bruce Sterling. He did a lot of like what he called himself futurist work, or he started this whole design fiction thing that is also pretty much connected to this idea of, I don't know, it's not so much about prediction, I guess, but about like sketching futures or imagining futures.
Yeah, well, what I was talking about just there was more about mainstream novels using science fiction. But I certainly have no problem with futurists using science fiction. I think it's a great idea. And making up the scenarios, everybody has fun with that. There's the method that Global Business Network always uses is the four scenarios that complement each other. And that's we like to make up stories, and I don't think there's anything wrong with that at all.
Have you been approached to participate in similar projects because I mean talking of it as a trend, or I don't know. I know you have been.
At times.
Yeah.
At times I've done some work with. There's a group in Palo Alto, and they're called some word with future. Why can't I think of their name? I'll think of it later, and we can dub it in. Future.
There's the Institute of the Future. I think this is a huge thing.
IFF,
right?
Institute for the Future,
okay.
IFF, in Palo Alto. Yeah, and they're real nice people, and sometimes they'll have science fiction writers working there, but I've given a lot of talks for them, and once they did an anthology of stories, and they paid me to put a story in there, and it was interesting. They had a conference, and so I was there talking about this story, and the people there were like, I think it was very expensive to attend the conference. It was, like $1,000. And the people there were like, well, I'm from Coca-Cola, I'm from Hallmark Cards, I'm from Shell Oil. I mean, people from really big companies are taking futurism seriously. Because, the world is so chaotic and nobody knows what's coming.
This is also probably because, I mean, as you said, in this distinction between science fiction and futurism, there is this more to the story, this more like maybe flipping coins a lot more than in this scenario sketching where it's all about plausibility, probability, prediction. But they use science fiction because they actually predict that it's getting more unpredictable that they can predict, right? That if one thing is sure, that it's more crazy than we imagine right now.
Okay, I think we're going to have to move because of that sound.
Oh, yeah. They're starting.
Yeah. Remind me what your question is.
My question was that actually, because you said before, you don't distinguishing between science fiction and futurology. You would say it's because you want like a good and trippy story and not the scenario. But don't the futurists especially ask you and other science fiction writers for scenarios because they also want them to be like trippy and maybe not this in this predictable, plausible way, but because especially because they are sure that if one thing is sure, then it's getting more crazy and unpredictable than we can imagine right now.
Okay, that's a good point. And the times that they've asked me to do like a story, if I make it crazy, they like that. There's one reason they like scenario building, I think, because your imagination, it kicks into gear more if you populate it, you know. If you're making up a scenario, if you put people in it, then that animates it and they're reacting to it and you care about this story more. And if you just make, you know, a dry prediction like people will use more solar power and, you know, telepathy might be possible. But if you put characters into it, then the story kind of grows itself because then the people interact and they have problems. And so it is a very useful tool. And of course, science fiction writers are good at that because we do that all the time.
And what ways or even tools, infrastructures, contexts you find interesting that these stories, be they called science fiction stories straightforward or scenarios, are discussed?
I'm not quite sure what you mean by infrastructure.
I mean, when universities or think tanks or whoever says, well, okay, we want to think about the future with science fiction. They sometimes write new stories in workshops or whatever, but they also commission writers to write stories for the anthologies, for instance.
Sure.
But then it's not only for the sake of reading a good story, but also that like this future thinking kind of has a common ground, right? They maybe. Are they ways of exchanging about these stories later that you find interesting?
I'm still not exactly sure what you're getting at. I mean, usually we have trouble selling our stories, and if somebody says they'll pay me to write a story, then I'm happy to write the story, and that's all the infrastructure I need.
Yeah.
And I don't really care very much about what they do with the story or what they think about it. And I mean, they might, if they make some comments and it's fun, then that's good. You mentioned you were at Arizona State University, and they wanted to make a website where they would post these stories that we'd written, and then they were imagining that people would then put lots of comments, like on a Facebook page, and we'd get all these threads self-generating. But then nobody really used their site. It's sort of like you have this seed of very sterile soil, and you're expecting plants to grow there, but we already have places to do that on the social network, and I don't think we're likely to use an artificial playpen social network just because it sounds like a good idea, but there's a limited amount of time that people have to do things on the web.
Yeah. But also, I mean, science fiction seems to be a lot of people call it like the most appropriate context, not only because of its like traditions and formats, but also because it has a specific community, right? People are get like involved in it and discuss these things, and you kind of, when you publish something, you don't get away with it if like people will really read it and discuss it.
Well, again, I think you have this idealized notion of what it's like to be a writer. I mean, I'll publish a story and I hear very, very little about it. I mean, sometimes there might be people who write a review like 100 words long of the story, you know, and basically they like it or they don't like it. And if there's something in the story that somebody considers to be a technical error, then they'll write the editor. Often I publish with Asimov's, and Sheila Williams is a dear friend. She's the editor. And then she'll forward that to me. And then if the complaints are reasonable, well, it's too late to fix it in the magazine, but then I'll go ahead and fix the story before I publish it in my complete stories. Yeah. So they are alert, but it's something, it's like in the old days, in the sort of golden age of science fiction, astounding stories, you would have these fanatical letter writing, because people didn't have much outlet for that. So now we just go and do something on the web, we do email, we do Twitter. But there could be these long, devoted fan threads. And there are things like the vulgar science fiction, like Star Wars or Star Trek, that, have the lowest type of fans. The professor says. Then they'll have fanzines, and they will endlessly debate, tiny details. Yeah. And that's just the really mass media science fiction will get that kind of chewing it over. But if you're writing a somewhat literary, somewhat avant-garde story and publishing it in a magazine, you're not going to get very much feedback.
Yeah, talking about avant-garde, I wanted to ask you about transrealism, because you said this is more like a mode of avant-garde writing, but than science fiction. But I was wondering that for me, transrealism resonated a lot with what I thought was the more interesting aspects of these futuring things, because it says especially that when the characters are out of control or something happens that you don't necessarily predict or think plausible, then it actually gets realist, because this is how the real world happens.
Yes.
So, yeah.
Well, that's true. There's always this thing that happens if that a writer's happy if your story takes on a life of its own, and you don't really know what the characters are going to do. It's usually, even for a story, I don't exactly know how it's going to end when I start it. I set them in motion, and then I'm continually thinking, what are the possibilities and what could happen. And then there's kind of a game designer once told me a principle that's useful in composing stories. If you have somebody and they're going to go from point A to point B, put up a barrier so they can't get there directly, and they have to go to point C first. And so that's kind of a composition principle that you use. And you can even then have a barrier between A and C. You can make it as hard as you like. But so that's something about making surprising things happen. Another thing I once saw somebody say, if you're writing a story and you think of some completely crazy, unexpected thing to happen to the characters, always do that. And that's pretty useful as a principle too. You think it's going along, and then just throw something in and ruin it, and then perturb the system would be another way to put it. So that's kind of trying to make a chaos laboratory, you could think of a story as.
Yeah. And this is also, I thought very related to scenario sketching, where disruption is often this element that you want in there.
Yes, for scenario sketching, you do want to disrupt, because it's like we have the 5-year plan of our fearless leaders, and that's never what's going to happen. So there's lots of disruption.
And then you also gave in your collected stories, you had this, I think it was 5 categories, right? Where you said, well, my stories are either this or that. And one was also thought experiments. I think actually the first one was thought experiments. How would you distinguish that from the transrealist writing?
Well, I was fascinated by the beatnik writers, and William Burroughs and Jack Kerouac and Allen Ginsberg in particular. And there was this quality that their novels or their poems were, it was pretty clear they were in some way directly about their personal life. Especially with Jack Kerouac, but also with William Burroughs. And but then it wasn't a memoir, because things weren't exactly true necessarily. They had warped them and made them more interesting or changed them in some way. And I thought, well, that's a good kind of writing to do. And partly it's, for a writer, again, many writers were very into ourselves, very egotistical. And the idea of being the hero of your novel, that's a satisfying idea. But then the other thing is the transreal is the trans part, where to make it unusual, that was the idea I had in writing science fiction. When I was starting to write around the late 1970s, early 1980s, it seemed like a lot of science fiction was, and it's still the case, was not really about well-rounded characters that are like human beings. There's a tendency to fall back on flat 2D stereotypes. And I thought, well, I'd like to write science fiction, but I'd also like it to be like a beatnik novel. So I'd like to have cool, kind of dense, emotionally complex characters. But then I don't want to just write a realistic novel. I mean, John Updike, he's, I'm never going to do that better than he does. So I'll throw in science fiction, and then that's a way to give it an extra layer. And so that's where Transreal comes from.
And the thought experiment then was more connected to your research or to your
right. Well,
being a mathematician.
I will do several different kinds of things in the same story. A thought experiment that's the what if. That's, what if I could fly? What if I had telepathy? What if I could travel backwards in time? And then what would happen? And here you kind of get into that futurism scenario thing, because if you just say what if, then you say, oh, I don't know, maybe this, maybe that. But if you embody it in a story, then it becomes, again, it's Einstein famously used that phrase, thought experiment, and you start filling it in and having characters subject to these conditions, then you will, by observing it and writing about it, you'll observe the outcomes, which are not always what you expected. And that's I was very interested always in the notion of robots having human intelligence. That's, a very classic trope in science fiction. And then I was really pushing on this idea in the late 1970s, and I got my PhD in mathematical logic, as I mentioned, and there's lots of philosophical or mathematical philosophical work speculating, can a machine think? It's sort of a dead horse. We've just beaten on that so much, but it's still an interesting problem. And then when I wrote my novel Software, I was kind of looking for a way to write about robots that were intelligent. And by then, I'd studied Gödel's incompleteness theorem quite closely. I even met Kurt Gödel. And I was at the Mathematics Institute in Heidelberg, Germany. And I spent a year there just thinking about the philosophy of what is consciousness, how can we have intelligence. And looked at it in a certain way, Gödel's theorem says that you can't, in fact, write down a simple description of consciousness. You sort of, a system can never really be as smart as itself. And then you'd have to be smarter than yourself, but you can't be smarter, so you can't describe what you're doing. And then, and Gödel made sort of a passing remark. He said, nevertheless, we could cause such a system to come into being. And he was very concise. He would just say this, and then you go and think about that for 3 years. And I eventually came to realize what he meant was that, or what he could have meant, was that you could evolve intelligent robots. And now this is kind of it's a very familiar idea. And when I first wrote about this was not at all a familiar idea. It was, I was like one of the first people to even write about that. And because it's too hard to design something, but evolution, I mean, how did we get our intelligence? From evolution. So then I had the idea of letting the robots evolve and become more like humans. And then the other step was, traditionally, like in Asimov, the robots, they're like engineers. They're boring. They're logical in the kind of boring sense of the word. They have no spark, no life. Even worse is sometimes when they'll have the machine talk in all capital letters. Like, you can speak English, but you don't know how to use the shift key. That's not too plausible. But so then I thought I should just go ahead and have the robots be like crazy people. And that was something I learned from Robert Sheckley, who was really my favorite writer as a boy. He's a wonderful story writer and very hip and cool. And his robots were always like people. And I thought, just go with that. Just have them be like people. And then you'll have interesting characters.
That's fascinating, yeah. Makes sense. I wanted to ask you also about, I mean, I don't know if this is part of the transrealism actually, but saucer wisdom.
Mm-hmm.
Was this for you like a transrealist novel?
Oh, yeah, it was one of the most transreal novels.
Okay.
Because, I mean, the main character is called Rudy Rucker.
Yeah.
But it's all lies. But, I mean, in some off way, I mean, he lives where I live. That was a strange, the way that book came into being was a strange thing, where Wired magazine wanted to start publishing books. And my friend Mark Frauenfelder was working there. And he later made his fortune with Boing Boing. He started that blog. But then he was an editor at Wired magazine, and I'd written some articles for Wired. And he says, why don't you write a book about futurology, a book about things that could happen. And then I thought, okay, I can make up a lot of ideas. And then I showed them to him, and he says, well, these are good ideas, but we need some sort of frame, like, where did you get these ideas? Could you make up some framework? And then I had this idea that it would be cool if I knew somebody who traveled into the future, and he actually came and told me these, and he'd seen these ideas. And then it just got crazier then. I had this friend visiting me. He was a veteran of the Navy. I went to college with him. And he, at that point, had really long hair and a really long beard. And he's sort of a forbidding demeanor. And so I went to my pitch meeting at Wired, and I brought this guy with me. His name's Greg Gibson. And I told them, this is a man named Frank Shook. And he's a friend of mine, and thinks he's been abducted by flying saucers very many times. And he told me the stuff that I'm going to put into this book for you. And they're not quite sure, if I'm kidding. But they believe me, because Greg was so forbidding. And then he suddenly jumped up and said, I don't want to talk about it. I don't want to talk about it. And he storms out of the meeting. And then these people, they're like young editors. They're like in their 20s. And they're just looking at me, They don't know what to think. And so then eventually I said, well, it's a scam, but I think we should just run with it and say that Rudy Rucker has gone crazy and he has a friend who's a saucer abductee. And then I was worried it would destroy what little credibility I have on the literary scene. But I thought, well, I mean, this is what that guy who made so much money with the saucer books did. The man who wrote all those books about being abducted. What was his name? I can't think of it right now. But anyway, but then in the end we decided to not insist that it was true. The thing is, at that point then Wired, their book division collapsed, and they had paid me an enormous advance, the biggest advance I ever got for a book. And then they didn't want to pay me because they weren't going to publish the book, but my agent made them pay me. And then I went to Tor Books, and they said, sure, we can publish it, but let's not insist that it's really true. Let's just say these are thought experiments. And then writing it was hard. Eventually the book became a novel. Now, eventually, I wasn't quite sure it would be a novel, but then, because it's sort of like Nabokov's book, Pale Fire. It's a long poem with a whole lot of footnotes about the poem by the editor. And that book is actually a novel, but the novel is hidden in the footnotes. And so I thought that's a really cool way to do the book. So then I had like Frank Shook's reports about the future, but then on the side, Rudy Rucker, the editor, keeps having interactions with Frank Shook, and like Frank steals my typewriter, and just eventually he gets me into a saucer, and so it's a very cool book. It's the strangest book I ever wrote.
Yeah, that's another, I mean, also footnote on, like, I guess, future and science fiction, because it's the strangest book he ever wrote, but it's also the one that was labeled non-fiction for a long time, right?
Well, I think Tor Books, they made a decision to call it popular science, non-fiction, futurology. And at the time, we thought that was a good idea, but I think it's better to call it a novel. I think that's what it actually is, and I think it has more appeal that way. But marketed as science fact, people didn't know what to make of it. Well, first there's people who just hate, because it's called Saucer Wisdom. So then they say, all right, this is a book by an idiot who believes in saucers. So that's, that turns all them off. But then the people who like saucers, they look at the book, and I'm making fun of them, I'm sort of making fun of Frank Shook the whole time and calling him a nut. So then those people were unhappy with it too. So it's a very hard book to pitch.
Well, I think it's super interesting that it was labeled non-fiction, like in this futurist context, because it also shows that, I mean, they try to really be on the safe side and say, well, we want science fiction based on hard science, and they want science fiction like as a label and as a community and as a genre, but they kind of want to get rid of the fiction part, and this does not work, because this is also the interesting part, this gap in between, right? Yeah, well,
it's the fiction and the story and the live characters and the humor and the dialogue and the images that make it a story you can connect with. Otherwise, it's just gobbledygook.
So, besides this futurology or futurist of future visions that is kind of, I think, very present in contemporary US science fiction, do you have like interactions with contemporary sci-fi and other writers that you find interesting in, or what aspects of contemporary science fiction you find appealing?
Well, I treasure my friendships with other science fiction writers. There aren't really so very many of us, really only a few hundred at any given time. And, well, the old Cyberpunk gang, like there's Bruce Sterling and William Gibson and John Shirley and Paul DeFilippo. And I love those guys, and I always love to talk to them. And I collaborate more than most science fiction writers do. I think Harlan Ellison collaborated a lot, but I think I've collaborated more than most people. I've written with Paul DeFilippo and Bruce Sterling, of course, and then Terry Bisson and Eileen Gunn and John Shirley and a couple of others I'm not thinking of right now. So I like that. I like working with them and getting the interplay. I don't go to science fiction conventions all that much. It's a lot of trouble, and I'm really not in the first tier of popularity in science fiction. I'm always been a little bit underground, and so I don't meet a huge number of people there who have read my work or are interested in it. So that's not very gratifying. And now that I'm older, if I go to a science fiction convention, they might not even give me a slot on any of the panels. And so then that's super frustrating. So then I don't want to go there. There's a lot of new writers coming up, and I'm not too familiar with their work. I mean, Charlie Jane Anders and Annalee Newitz. I just went to a presentation they did the other day, and that was good. And when I was editing Flurb, I did 14 issues of an online science fiction e-zine called Flurb. And then I was working with a bunch of younger writers. And some of them are still around. And that was, I enjoyed that a lot. Though the thing is, as Flurb got more popular, then it got to be more work to run it, because then more people were sending me stories, and it just got out of control. I couldn't do it anymore. But, so, yeah, I love science fiction writers. They're always great people.
So I have another few questions, actually, not about these futurist things, but about your writing, especially. So I was wondering, actually, like maybe also reading Source of Wisdom, if are you like a science-informed animist?
Yeah, I would even go further than animism. You might know I wrote a book called Hylozoic, and that's a Greek word, and hylo is matter, and zoic is alive, and that's the doctrine that everything is alive. And animist is sort of the same. It's saying everything is intelligent. They're kind of almost the same thing. And I think if you analyze it, and I've talked about this with Stephen Wolfram. He's like the great prophet of a new kind of science, a new way of thinking about physical computation as being, it's as rich as anything in a computer. You always, like example I always think of is if I look at like the leaves on a tree, and if they're moving slightly in the wind, they're doing something, a chaotic computation. And generally any chaotic system is, logically speaking, is capable of universal computation. That is, it can emulate any behaviors whatsoever if you find a way to do the input and output. Another example I always use, if you look at a stone, well, how could you say a stone is alive? Well, it has an octillion atoms in it, and they're connected to each other via things a little bit like springs, the forces, that they're vibrating. And then there's a quantum field around them, they're entangled. And so it's just exceedingly rich system. So, I mean, why not say that could be alive and conscious? I think we get so hung up on imagining that we're the summit of creation. The world would be fine if we were gone. It would still be, a very interesting place.
Yeah.
So, so I've always liked that idea. And the idea of the universe as a whole being alive, that's also an idea I like. That's a sort of pantheism. And I'm comfortable with that. It makes me feel at home in the universe. Mm-hmm. There was a man, Fechner, in the 19th century, and he wrote a lot about hylozoism. And he said, well, if you imagine that the universe is all dead and we're just these few spots of light, of life and intelligence, then it's like you're in this huge warehouse full of, and there's no lights, and there's just this dark machinery there that you can bump into, and we're just fireflies, in the darkness. And that's a sort of unpleasant way to think of the world. And he said, or we can take the daylight view of the world, and we just imagine that the lights are on and everything is illuminated with intelligence. And I think that's a more pleasant way to think of the world. Mm-hmm.
So this obviously informs your writing, right?
Sure.
Yeah. But how does it affect not only your perception of the world, but your living in it, kind of?
Well, I'm always trying to be comfortable in my own skin and trying not to be stressed out and trying to be, well, there's the thing of remorse over what you did in the past, and then there's the fear of the future. And in the now you can be compulsive about accomplishing some task. So to kind of uncouple from that whenever I can. I mean, I'm like anybody else, so I get hung up on the game, and I forget all my good intentions. But if I can mellow out and feel like all is one, I'm part of the universe, I'm safe, there's nothing to worry about, that's a touchstone for me. Mm-hmm.
That's very interesting what you said about the world also, like, as in itself being alive, like the cosmos or the universe. And it's what a lot of philosophers or like contemporary academics right now are doing with this new turn of post-humanism, right? Are you interested in that at all, or do you have any thoughts on that?
You mean specifically, what about posthumanism?
Yeah, like this new, like critical posthumanism that is not so much about transhumanist futures, but more about we become posthuman by thinking differently about the world, not by manipulating so much our bodies and cognitive features.
I'm not sure I know much about that movement, but I mean, it sounds reasonable. The transhumanism is something a little bit different. That's like in Silicon Valley, people that are obsessed with uploading their mind into the cloud, which for science fiction, I think that's a very interesting theme. I wouldn't want to center my life around it. I heard a funny story. Some guy I know, he was saying his grandfather died and left his father, a good sum of money. And the family was living in poverty. Like the father said that he couldn't afford to send them to college and couldn't get them clothes. But he knew the father had all this stash of money. And he was like, what did he want the money for? And turns out he was using the money to buy a policy to get his head frozen when he died. Thanks a lot, Dad.
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah.
So, I mean, this is kind of a cliche, but is it really happening a lot? Is this like mainstream Silicon Valley, almost religion, this transhumanism thing?
No, it's not.
Yeah.
I mean, I've met some guys here that are really into it, and
Okay.
they're interesting guys, but it's just, I think the underlying idea is something I was writing about in the Where series, or even in software, was the idea of, can you extract your personality and create a reasonable simulacrum of yourself that would be, in principle, immortal? And I think that's going to happen. I've written about it, as you probably know. I refer to that as a life box, and I discuss it. There's a whole nonfiction book I wrote, The Life Box, the Seashell, and the Soul. And I think we're getting close to it, and I've lectured on it. Here again, this is I think it's at Institute for the Future. I was talking at one of their things, and there are these guys from Hallmark Cards, and they say, "Oh, we're working on that." And from time to time, I read about there's people that do this. They never acknowledge my work. They never mention me. But the prophet is without honor until a movie is made of one of his books. But the idea of making a model of yourself, I think, basically, it's, as I mentioned earlier, it's very hard to really do AI properly, and it's not clear we'll ever get it. We're getting closer with deep learning and evolving neural nets, and it's to some extent a matter of emulation, and then maybe under the surface it'll be doing something original. But if you want to make a model of somebody, you just need a really big data set. If you can have all the things they ever said, all the things they wrote, and if you can have that sort of like in effect like a little bit of a hidden website, and then you can just put a front end on it where you go to that page and you ask a question and it delves into that database, just basically a Google search on it, and it produces some hits, and then it'll just regurgitate those quotes, or it'll weave them together with a little bit of very low-end AI to make them into sentences, and even have them seem to respond to what you said. And then it could remember, for each user, it could remember what the users talked about in the past. So it'll act like it knows you, and it'll say, well, the other day we were talking about such and such, and it could be quite convincing. We're sort of easy to fool that way. I mean, so you can just do a circle with 3 dots, and people will say, oh, that's cute, it likes me. But so I think that's going to be a big business. And everybody, when they reach a certain age, they want to write an autobiography, they want to be remembered. And if we could find a way to make this fairly painless, and I've written about it a lot, so I think that's a technology. And that's the kind of thing I'm always telling if I talk to business people. You should get on this. This is going to be a huge business. But then they always look away. I know if I'm making a really good futuristic prediction, people don't want to talk about it. Or, can we talk about something else?
They rather use this intelligence for a self-driving car or for something similar boring, right?
Intelligence for self-driving cars, yeah, that's good.
Yeah.
I got to ride in one with Bruce Sterling, actually. We were over at Google, and they let us ride around for a while. It was sort of cool.
But that's also something that science fiction talks about, right? You have this crazy technology, but then it's used for something very mundane, very boring, or something very commercial. Like, I don't know, there's brain implants, but then it's the big thing to use it is produce rock videos or whatever.
Well, it's, William Gibson's famous phrase, the street finds its own uses for things. And, well, even the internet, it's still pretty good. I think sometimes people say, well, it's been dragged down, there's so many ads and, spam and propaganda. But really, all in all, it's still pretty amazing. It's just, to me, that's a miracle that it got out of the box right away. I mean, the government and business never owned the internet, and they can't ever. It's just too sprawling now. It's too ubiquitous. And I think that's a really cool, positive thing. And pretty much you can publish anything you want to on the internet, And the media, they always jump on these small, isolated things that are, well, what about hate speech, or what about revenge porn? And, okay, these things are terrible and they happen, but that's really not the overall gestalt of what the internet is. I mean, mostly I'm finding things that are interesting to me, art, literature, fiction, how to do things, and it's great, and it's free, and it's pretty much uncensored.
Yeah. It was interesting that you started with the robots, because you also read or thought a lot about biotechnology, right? Like all this bioengineering, also in a less mundane way, maybe, especially a lot of creature, a lot of new pets, stuff like that.
I like to think about that. Well, Sylvia, my wife, she always says, I love critters. Yeah. I'm always putting them in my paintings and in my fiction. Yes. And she's always saying, don't use so many critters this time, but I can't stop myself.
Why is that?
Well, it's like this Bosch Bruegel kind of thing. I just like creating. Yeah. There's a phrase, it's an old phrase, sort of an old cartoonist phrase, eyeball kicks. So a kick to your eyeball. So kicks is a good time, and I like to put in eyeball kicks. So there's things like in the old Mad magazine, there'd be little things in the corners of the frames, and you just see that, and then you're like, wow, that's something else. So the critters, they're there for eyeball kicks.
Yeah. Well, as you know, the Wanderer you're painting is in my living room. That's nice. So this is also like this landscape, and then you have a few eyeball kicks, I guess.
Right, those little guys, yeah. Yeah, they're sort of like the 7 sins or something. Yeah. But I think biotech, we haven't really talked about that much, but I think that is going to be just huge in the 21st century, and we're really just getting started with it. The thing about biology, it's always so much more complicated than you imagined. But if you read like a technical article, it's always, you think, okay, I've got it, and then they're like, but wait. It's just so unbelievably gnarly. So we're still really walking in baby shoes there. And, but I think we could have all sorts of cool stuff. It seems reasonable to imagine that in 100 years we won't be using chip-based computers at all. It just seems it shouldn't be that hard to make living things that can act like a cell phone. I don't see why it couldn't be done. Mm-hmm.
So, talking of critters, there's also a lot of tentacles in your paintings, in your writings. Yeah, what about the tentacles?
Well, I like that kind of curve. It's mathematically, I've always been interested in curves that they're sort of infinitely differentiable. That is, they're very, very smooth, but they're not just like a part of a circle or an ellipse. Mm-hmm. Like they curve back on themselves. And I like to try to draw them, and I like seeing them and thinking about them. And I love on octopuses, they say that their antenna, each tentacle has really as much intelligence as their brain, and that's very cool to think about. Because we give too much credit to the brain sometimes, and that the tentacles, they're very cool.
But not only octopus, there's a lot of jellyfish also, right? That have
jellyfish. I also love. They're mathematically pretty simple to understand what they're doing, and Bruce Sterling, he's always nostalgic about. We wrote a story about giant flying jellyfish. It's called Big Jelly, and even. I mean, that was a long time ago. It was like 20 years ago at least. And he still will always send me, whenever he sees something funny about jellyfish, he'll always send me the link.
I've just been to the Monterey Bay Aquarium.
Yes.
And this also appears in several spots, like in your novels.
Yes.
Do you still go to that place sometimes, or what's up with the Monterey Bay?
Not so much now. It's too crowded now, but Bruce and I actually were there for a conference of I think computer-human interfaces, and we were speaking there. And part of the conference was in the Monterey Bay Aquarium, and they had a big show of jellyfish that time, and that's sort of where we got into it, to writing that story.
Yeah, it's a fascinating place. I mean, I've also been to the jellies mostly when I was there.
Yeah, the jellies, they're amazing. It's fun to just see. Well, there's always, it's a truism, but we sometimes long to see alien creatures, but we've really got some things here that are about as alien as you could want. And the whole deal with whales and dolphins and their languages, that's just such a fascinating thing. And, we just know nothing about all these things.
Well, maybe to wrap it up, to not pick your brain too much, may I ask, you told me you're painting a lot right now, right? Mm-hmm. Are you writing also? Are you still like thinking science fictional?
Writing stories now.
Okay.
I finished a novel. Well, the last novel I wrote was Return to the Hollow Earth, and that was I finished that about a year ago.
Yeah, it's quite recently. Yeah, that's true.
And it actually was published before my novel Million Mile Road Trip, which I finished about 2 years ago, and that just was published. And those two they're good novels. I don't feel like my quality has fallen off. I think they're as good a novel as I can write. And somehow I just don't have the energy right now to write another novel. I always say it's like you've rowed across the Atlantic Ocean in a rowboat, and then somebody says, "Well, when are you going to row back?" Just not today. But I love writing and painting. I like creative activities because then I forget myself. The voices in my head stop, and I'm just with the art. And any kind of creative activity is that way. You're just into the medium, and it's fun, and you're learning. It's very satisfying. It's this corner of the world where you have control, and so much of the world is out of our control, and it's pleasant to have some place where you can do what you like, and the art. I mean, I've been doing it a long time, and I know how to make it look the way I like it to be. So I enjoy writing, but recently I've been writing short stories, and I might just stay with that for a while. Mm-hmm.
Well, 2 novels in the last 2 years, it's not, I mean, we can't complain, I guess.
Okay, yeah, there's no rush.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Julie. It's very nice to have you here.